Hi, I'm Jimmy. In this video, we're looking at how to perform an industry analysis using Porter's 5 forces, and we're going to use Tesla as our example. So we're going through each of the 5 steps in Porter's 5 forces, and just so we're all aware, this video is intended to be a complement to a video I did a few months back called The 8 Steps to Analyzing a Company for Analysis. So this is the industry analysis portion. That was the company analysis portion. Okay, so Porter's 5 forces helps us break down an industry to more fully understand the intensity of the competition within that industry. And this is a good place to start whenever we're analyzing a company's strategy and when we're trying to identify the potential strengths of that company and the potential weaknesses of it. Okay, so let's jump in. So the first one of Porter's 5 forces is the threat of new entrants. So with the threat of new entrants, what we're looking for is we're looking for the potential of another company coming into, in this case, Tesla's automotive industry and competing with them. The more companies that come into the industry, well, the worse that is for the companies that are already in that industry. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is to determine the threat level for each of Porter's 5 forces. So we're simply going to use high, medium, or low to identify the threat level. Clearly, low threat is the best possible version. And in an ideal situation, there would be a company that had a low threat level for all of Porter's 5 forces, and that would mean, in theory, that the company is well positioned for long-term profitability and dominance within their industry. So how can we determine the level of the threat of new entrants? Well, in Tesla's case, I think it's important to focus on barriers to entry. So here, we want to analyze how difficult it is for a new company to get into the industry. Now, there are a few different things that we could use to determine barriers to entry. One of them is we could ask ourselves, are there economies of scale in place already? Economies of scale imply that larger companies have an advantage over smaller companies, since in theory, it would cost a larger company less to make a product versus a smaller company. So in the case of the auto industry with Tesla, yes, economies of scale are absolutely present since large companies tend to have a pricing advantage. Another thing that we can look at is product differentiation. And clearly, for Tesla in the auto industry, their product is quite different, and that gives them a huge advantage. It's not easy for somebody else to come in and redo what they're doing or even innovate it further. Then we want to consider how much money it costs to run the business. So once again, in the case of Tesla, it would cost a decent amount of money for a new company to come in and launch an automobile manufacturer. So that would make the barriers to entry even higher for potential new entrants. Then we'd like to consider switching costs. So if we were to look at Tesla's customers, how expensive or how difficult it is for a customer to switch from, let's say, driving a Ford to driving a Tesla. Here, we could say that it's probably very low switching costs, if any at all. So that's a good thing for the competitiveness of this particular part of the analysis. Now, we could go on and on about how to analyze economies of scale, but just so we have some ideas for our future analysis of Porter's 5 forces, well, we can also look at things like how accessible is distribution of their products? Or is the government going to block it at all? This is particularly true for oil companies or drilling companies, things like that. So with that in mind, and looking at the entire picture of Tesla in their industry, well, I'm going to say that it's a low threat that new entrants are going to come in, which at the end of the day, this is a positive thing for Tesla stock. Okay, so our next one on Porter's 5 forces is the bargaining power of suppliers. So this is important because the less power that a supplier has over a business, well, that's better for the business. So if we were running, let's say, a lemonade stand, and there were 100 different places nearby that we could buy lemonades from, well, 2 things would happen. First, the price of lemonades is likely to be quite low. And second, it's unlikely that we're going to run out of lemonades anytime soon. Both of those are good signs for our business. Well, in the case of Tesla, they actually spell it out quite clearly for us in their quarterly and annual filings in a section called supply risk. So in this section, they say that the majority of their suppliers are the only place that they can get the necessary components that they need for their product. So right off the bat, we know that with this one of Porter's 5 forces, we know that the threat is high. And this could be a bad thing for Tesla or Tesla's business, because ultimately having limited suppliers implies that suppliers could either raise prices Or if the supplier ever runs into manufacturing issues, well, that will have a direct reflection on Tesla's ability to manufacture. Now, in a very similar version as this, we have the bargaining power of buyers. Now, with Tesla, the bargaining power of buyers or their customers, well, it's actually quite low because Tesla sells to so many different customers and no one customer represents a large portion of their revenue. Well, customers are going to have very limited negotiating power. And we should be able to find this information in the annual or quarterly filings as well, if you're ever looking for where to find it. So we can see that the bargaining power of customers and the bargaining power of suppliers are very related. Take Tesla's supplier situation where they only have a few suppliers. Well, I'm guessing that Tesla is a very large customer of those suppliers. So in theory, Tesla would have a lot of bargaining power over that supplier as a customer. So that sword sort of slices both ways. The two of them are most likely to try to work together and keep their business growing. Okay, so for this force, I think it makes sense to say that there's a low threat when it comes to the bargaining power of buyers. And next, we have the threat of substitutions. Okay, let's think this one through. So Tesla makes electric vehicles, and this is clearly a very unique product. But we don't have to buy an electric vehicle. We could buy a more traditional gas-powered vehicle. We could buy a hybrid vehicle. We could take public transportation. So there are other choices. Tesla's vehicle isn't the only choice that we have when it comes to buying a vehicle. So yes, Tesla makes a very unique vehicle, but that doesn't mean that there are no substitutes for their product. So here, I think it makes sense to mark down the threat of substitutes as a high risk for Tesla or a high threat for Tesla. Okay, now we're moving on to our fifth and final force in Porter's 5 forces, rivalry among existing competitors. So as we can see, all the forces sort of play into this one. And what we're looking for here is things like how many competitors are there? In theory, the more competition that there is, the worse that is for the companies in that industry. There's likely pressure on margins. There's likely pressure on sales. They'd have to do more discounts, things along those lines. But then we want to look at things like product differentiation or switching costs. Now, we know that a customer can switch fairly easily from a one car company to another car company. And when it comes to differentiation, well, Tesla clearly has tons of differentiation when compared to their competitors. Now, clearly, we can tell that there's a ton of competition within the auto manufacturer's industry. And we know that because, for example, Tesla recently reduced the price of their Model 3 car. There's no reason to cut the prices of your vehicles unless there's competition out there driving customers in a different direction. So clearly that would indicate that there's high rivalry amongst manufacturers in the auto industry. Plus, we know how many deals or sales are being offered by different car manufacturers at different times of the year. All of this points to a high threat level when it comes to rivalry amongst competitors. But we don't want to completely write off the fact that Tesla is in fact a unique vehicle and they make very different cars. And if we want a high quality electric vehicle, Tesla may be the only logical choice. So assuming that they get some points for how different their product is, but they're also in the middle of a very fiercely competitive auto market, well, I think that it makes sense for this particular one of Porter's 5 forces to mark this threat as a medium threat. Now, I want to point out that Porter's 5 forces, as an analysis in general, is very company specific. As you could imagine, if we were doing the same analysis for Ford, well, this would end up looking very different. And I think it's important to realize that the goal here is to more fully understand the entire process, what the company goes through, and where the future of their business possibly lies. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, if we want to do a thorough analysis of a company, I believe this is a good place to start. And then the other video that I mentioned, where I called it the 8 steps to analyzing a stock, there's a link in the description below if you're interested. That would be the next place I would go to after we do this analysis. So please let me know what you think of Porter's 5 forces in the comments below. And do you think that Porter's 5 forces are a good way to analyze an industry in general? Did I leave anything out about Tesla or about the process that you would have included? And if you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end of the video, and I'll see you in the next video.